You may know that traditionally we have a refugee resettlement process in the United States that requires that refugees go through an established refugee agency. But when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan last summer, there was a pilot project called Sponsor Circles that began and that was significantly expanded to help address the need of bringing many Afghans to the United States in a very short time frame and resettling them in the United States all over the country through this Sponsor Circles program. And then when the Ukrainian invasion occurred in February, shortly after that, the United States government decided to expand the Sponsor Circle program and allow these Sponsor Circles to also host Ukrainians who were fleeing from the war in Ukraine. And the United States government also then authorized the availability of humanitarian parole for many of these Ukrainians. So the Sponsor Circles are individuals, private citizens like you and I. You have to have at least 5 persons who come together and form a sponsor circle. And you basically pledge to support the Afghan people or the Ukrainian people who you are sponsoring for about 90 days. And that includes everything from, housing and employment and schooling and all that sort of thing that you help them adjust. So many of these sponsor circles have been formed and they've been certified through some national organizations that are working with sponsor circles. But as they are preparing for the Ukrainians who they are going to host, they are helping to file these humanitarian parole applications. And most of these folks in the sponsor circles are not attorneys. So they're filling out these humanitarian parole applications and related paperwork, but they would like an attorney to review that before it is filed, to make sure that they've filled it out properly and they have the right documents attached and that sort of thing. And that's really where all of you come in. These are not long applications by any means. And in fact, the government has shortened the process, as Shannon will tell you in just a moment, in terms of what's required to file for one of these Ukrainians. And so it won't take you that long to prepare or really review. You aren't even doing the preparation. The sponsor circle is preparing the document, and then you're going to be looking it over. And so with that, I think I will turn it over to Shannon. I will have her talk a little bit about the process. Then at the end, I'll tell you what the next steps are, and we'll have a chance for some questions and answers. And Shannon and I have also put together a short resource sheet that you should have received by email with your link for the training today. And that sheet has some links on it to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service website, where you can find the forms and instructions. It also has some links to other pro bono organizations that have put together instructions about how to complete the application. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We're just sharing with you some resources that are already available to you on the web. All right, so with that, Shannon, I'm going to mute myself and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Cindy. And thanks again to all of you for your interest in this program. I wanted to start just for those of you who are not typically in the immigration area, just explaining a little bit more about what humanitarian parole usually is. So a humanitarian parole is a benefit that allows people who are not eligible for visas to come into the United States, just temporarily, for what USCIS deems urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. So, for example, what it's usually used for is if someone is in need of critical medical treatment, but for whatever reason they're not eligible to come as a visitor, or that wouldn't allow them to complete the treatment. On the flip side, if they have a relative in the U.S. who needs medical treatment or who needs their support, care, assistance during that treatment, that's something that it can be used for. The significant public benefit aspect sometimes is medical trials, drug trials, or other kind of treatment trials. But it's not all medical related. So a lot of times if someone has legal proceedings in the US that they need to return for or to come for, that's another sort of significant public benefit that USCIS looks at. So when looking at the humanitarian parole application, USCIS will consider, is it something that can be done in a reasonable, specific period of time? They look at the applicant's background, if they have any criminal history, and they look at what's going to be important for our purposes is how the person's going to be supported financially while they're here. And it's typically a process that you're not supposed to use to circumvent the regular immigration process, or as Cindy mentioned, the refugee process. But those processes can be pretty lengthy. And so, typically a person would first have to apply for a visa, get rejected for that visa, and then they could apply for humanitarian parole by filing an I-131. That's the application for advanced parole that they have to submit to USCIS before they can even get to the I-134 that we're going to be reviewing. So, and also another difference just to note, because it will be relevant when we're going over the form, is that for other types of humanitarian parole, the person can sponsor themselves. They don't necessarily need a financial sponsor from the US, but for the Ukrainian program, USCIS created a special program just for Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion. So it's streamlined, so they don't have to first apply for a visa and get rejected by the embassy. They don't have to file the I-131 with USCIS, but they do need a sponsor, and so that's where we're coming in, right? It's the sponsor who'll be signing these Form I-134. That's the Declaration of Financial Support. It used to be called an Affidavit of Support, so if I accidentally say affidavit sometimes, sorry. But they will have to sign that on behalf of someone, seeking to enter from the Ukraine. And if it's approved, then the person gets admitted for 2 years. Right now, that is the amount of time that USCIS has granted. I guess depending on what happens over the next 2 years, they may extend that or allow them to renew it. It's hard to say right now, but for right now, they're talking about a 2-year period. So specifically the Ukrainian program, United for Ukraine, it's filed online, which again is part of the streamlining process, which has been great. I wish they would have done that for the Afghans as well. But so they can file online. The sponsor has to submit the I-134. They have to be sponsoring a specific Ukrainian. So in other words, I get this question a lot. You can't just submit one saying, I'm willing to support somebody. They have to be matched with a specific person. They can support multiple beneficiaries. So if it's a family, they can sponsor all members of the family, but they have to submit a different I-134 for each family member. And then when you go to file it online, they get linked up. So hopefully they can all travel as a family. And additionally, like the sponsor circles that Cindy referenced, multiple sponsors can join together to sponsor a beneficiary or a family. And in that case, they would still just file one I-134 for each person. So it's sort of the opposite. If the sponsor, an individual sponsor is sponsoring multiple beneficiaries, they have to do I-134s for each one. But if multiple sponsors are supporting one beneficiary, they just need one I-134 for that one person, and they are all listed on there. So I'm not sure if the applications that we'll be looking at will be for multiple sponsors, but I just thought I'd mention that so that you could be aware. But basically going through the form, and I don't know if everyone saw in the invite, there was a list of resources, as Cindy mentioned, and one of them is a link to the I-134, which you can find on the USCIS website. But I just kind of wanted to go through it point out some things that, again, you know, if you're not typically practicing in immigration law, you might not be aware of, and there might be some confusion. So number one is just at the very beginning, part one, basis for filing. So it says, I'm filing on behalf of myself or another individual. And so for the United for Ukraine program, it's always going to be that second box. So you want to make sure that your sponsors understood the part that they're playing there. So part two is information about the beneficiary. And that would be the Ukrainian national that they are sponsoring. So part two lists a bunch of biographical information that they would need. And one thing that kind of jumped out at me, it asked for the person's alien registration number. Well, most of these applicants, I'm guessing, will not already have an alien registration number. The alien registration number is usually assigned once someone is granted a visa or is living in the US in some sort of legal status. But there might be some applicants who have been here before or who have had pending cases where they might have the alien registration number, but don't be surprised if they don't already have one. That's not typically something that's issued before they get here, I should say. And then the next thing that jumped out at me, as I mentioned, the length of stay. So on the form, it allows you to choose dates, which of course we won't know specific dates, but you can kind of guess based on when the application is being filed. You know, obviously it'll be a starting point sometime after that, and then a 2-year period. Because again, right now that's all that USCIS is authorizing. I think if the person checked the box that says no end date, it would probably still be fine because, you know, again, they're not going to know specific dates until they know if they're going to be approved, right? But if, you know, they wanted to guess with specific dates, they could put the 2 years there. And then it also asks, and this is where, again, it might be confusing to some sponsors and beneficiaries, that it's asking for the beneficiary's income and assets information from them. So this is only referring to income or assets that they could access while they're here in the US to help in their support. And so some of our beneficiaries may have some assets that they're able to bring with them. Some of them may not. But, you know, if they do, they can list it there. If they don't, you know, that's what the sponsor's for. And they need the sponsor to list their financial information too, regardless. So, but if they do have some assets, it may help sway in their favor for the application to be granted. Some of the assets that USCIS lists on those drop boxes were just checking accounts, saving accounts. They list annuities, stocks and bonds, retirement funds, real estate, stuff like that. So beneficiaries may have some of those things, but they may not be able to access them while they're here. So, you know, that's just something to think about looking through the information that they provide. And I just see a question here, what to do if there's no alien registration number, which I'm about to come back to that because now we're on to the sponsor's information. And again, in that section, it asks at some point for the sponsor's alien registration number, and they might not have it. If you're born here, for example, obviously you don't have an alien registration number. So you can just leave it blank. It's not going to reject the application if you leave that blank. Or I don't know if online there's an option to put not applicable. You know, usually when we type the forms to fill out on paper, we can do that, but I'm not sure on the online system if they have a way to do that. But yeah, so part 3 goes through the sponsor's information. Again, their biographic information. And when it gets to, let's see, what's that? Financial information. So this part I thought might confuse people because question 15, that's on page 6, it's asking for information about yourself, meaning the sponsor, and all of your dependents and any other individuals they financially support, and to list any contributions that they're going to give to the potential beneficiary. So the sponsor, for example, might be married with children, so they would need to list their spouse and children on the form. But if they have young children, obviously they're not going to be contributing towards the beneficiary. So they would just put 0 there, and so that part could be a little confusing. And then if there are multiple sponsors, the instructions say that they would then include their name in that section, and then also the supplemental documents, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, of proof of their financial stability and things like that. So let's see, and then it asks to list any other beneficiaries that they have already or plan to file I-134s for. And then the last thing, I thought, it's something we always struggle with in just normal applications, is what to put on the question 24 that asks, I intend or I do not intend to make specific contributions to the support of the beneficiary. So typically they would put I intend to, because that's sort of the purpose of this program, right? They're pledging a certain amount or certain types of support, like room and board, and so that's what you would want to list there. Where you would say I do not intend is if it's just a one-time financial offer. Say, I'm going to give $10,000 or something like that. That would be not a specific contribution, even though it's a specific amount of money. It's not for a specific purpose. So that's what that means. But I think most of these sponsors would be putting specific things such as room and board or housing, things like that. So, and then again, just as a reminder, the beneficiaries are not allowed to sign on behalf of themselves. So that whole Part 4 does not apply. So if you get an I-134 where the person has filled out Part 4, they should not have. They should skip to Part 5. That's where the sponsor signs and certifies that they understand the application and that they're willing to support this beneficiary. So those are the main points in the forms. I also just wanted to briefly discuss, and I see we have several questions in the chat, so we'll get to those at the end. But just wanted to go over outside of the form what the sponsor needs to submit, to show that they're able to financially support the beneficiary. So they would typically want to submit their tax return. We usually recommend for the last 3 years to show a steady source of income. They would want to submit recent pay stubs to show that they're still employed, because even if you filed your taxes last year, you might not be employed today. Similarly, they could submit what we call an employment verification letter. And also, just depending on the circumstances, they might submit bank statements for several months, evidence of other assets, as I mentioned earlier, if the person's not employed, if they're retired, or if they're self-employed, they might have different types of documents to show their financial stability. So it's kind of case by case, but what you typically see are tax returns, recent pay stubs, employment verification. So those are the main things to look for. And just other, like I said, other specific contributions, just getting it right from the USCIS website. It says, receiving the beneficiary upon arrival and making sure that they have housing, so that would be a specific contribution that they could list. But again, they still need to show the financial capability to provide that contribution. So in this, specific program we're discussing here, you're just limited to, or not limited, but the only thing they're asking you to do is to review the I-134, make sure it's filled out correctly, and make sure that the appropriate supporting documents are listed there. For those of you who would like to do more, I'm sure there's opportunities for that, but that's sort of just a very basic overview of the process. So let me see if I can scroll up here and see what other questions I didn't cover. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so if they don't have an alien registration number, we should just leave it blank. And then, yes, multiple sponsors. As I mentioned, it's sort of confusing because if there's multiple beneficiaries, they each need their own I-134, but if multiple sponsors are sponsoring, you know, the same beneficiary, they can all be listed on one I-134. And what they do is, in that one section, I think it was question 15 on part 3, where they ask for income of other people willing to contribute to the beneficiary. Oh, and so thank you, Kelly. What asked when it asks relationship to the beneficiary, what if there is none? Sorry, I meant to say there doesn't have to be one. If there is one, they can put it there. But if not, you know, they can leave it blank or just put sponsor, you know. Sometimes it's a relative, but sometimes it's not. You know, we've had a lot of just generous people joining the Sponsor Circle program. So that's okay if there's no relationship. Another question was, does a Ukrainian individual have to be in Ukraine or Europe to meet health screening? No, they do not have to be in Ukraine. Typically they are not. Most of them have already fled to other countries. I don't think they specifically have to be in Europe either, but there are health screening requirements that may be difficult depending on what country they're in, because I believe the US, for example, only recognizes certain COVID vaccines. I don't know if they're still requiring that. But there's also a process once the Ukrainian the beneficiaries arrive here, they have to do some more medical screening for specifically tuberculosis. I'm not sure if there's anything else, but they're given the information about that. But no, they don't have to be in the Ukraine or specifically Europe, really. It's just a matter of logistics for where they can go. Okay, and then, okay, so there was a question, does the applicant have to include the sponsor's financial information in both Part 2 and Part 3? So no, the sponsor's financial information is just in Part 3. It's only the beneficiary's information that's in Part 2. And I did think that that was going to be confusing because, you know, the way it's worded is what income will the beneficiary be relying on? And so they're going to be relying on the sponsors, but specifically in Part 2, what they want listed is any income or assets that the beneficiaries themselves have that they'll be relying on, and the sponsors just goes in Part 3. So another good question, are we considered a preparer? So Cindy and I had talked about this beforehand because we were a little unsure on that one. Technically, you'll be receiving filled out forms that have already been prepared. And so as in Illinois, you know, you have sort of limited scope representation opportunities. That's more what this would be. You know, to me, the preparer is the one who actually fills it in, types it out, and, you know, and has reviewed the validity of the documents submitted, which we aren't really doing. We're just making sure the form is filled out correctly and that they know what documents they should submit, but we're not acting as their attorneys. We're not, you know, providing advice, at least for this particular program. Like I said, if there are people who wanted to take on a more active role in pro bono representation, I'm sure that would be welcome. So did I get that right, Cindy? I think. Okay, she's nodding. Right.
Yes, I think that is correct.
Thanks. Okay, and then let's see, Julia asked about the 765 form. So that is something that happens after the beneficiary is already here. You know, like I said, this particular program, we're just helping the sponsors out with reviewing the I-134 Declaration of Financial Support. But there, you know, once the beneficiaries arrive here, as I said, they'll need other types of support. The 765, which for those of you who don't know, is the application for employment authorization. So they may need assistance with that. There was some discussion about trying to even make that easier and make it incident to status, which for those of you not in immigration law, there's certain types of visas or status that you enter the US and you're allowed to work because of that, and you don't have to file a separate application. But there's other types, you know, when you do need a separate document showing that you can work, because not everyone is automatically authorized to work. So hopefully they'll change that and make it a little bit easier in these cases. Okay, and back to the, are we the preparers? Someone asked, Seth asked, if we are considered preparers, is our representation going to extend beyond preparation of the I-134? I would say no to that question. That basically would mean that you're putting yourself on the hook for those future applications. So, you know, maybe talk to the specific program director if they have a need for people to do that. If you want to do that, that's something that I'm sure could be arranged. But for what we're being asked to do with this particular program is just to review that, and it doesn't extend beyond that. So, and let's see. Okay, so Laura asked, can you explain why the beneficiary does not fill out the statement on page 8? So I think that's the, yeah, so that's only for beneficiaries who are sponsoring themselves. So remember at the beginning when I mentioned that typically when someone's asking for humanitarian parole, they are allowed to sponsor themselves. So an example I have from my personal practice is I have a client who needs surgery that's not available in his home country. And so he is not eligible for a visitor's visa for whatever reason. So he applied for humanitarian parole and sponsored himself. And he did have the assets. He had to show enough assets to pay for his, you know, room and board while he was here and for his medical expenses. So that would be when the beneficiary would fill that out and fill out that certification that, you know, they will be supporting themselves. But in this case, because the beneficiaries in the United for Ukraine program are not allowed to be their own sponsor, they don't fill that part out. So hopefully that clarifies it. Let's see. Back to the types of financial documents. Somebody asked, would it be to submit certified IRS transcripts, W-2s, 1099? Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, the sponsor can submit as much as they want. I know for regular cases with USCIS, they have been asking more and more for those IRS transcripts rather than just copies of your tax returns. But I don't think that would be required here. They being the agency, USCIS, a little bit more lenient with respect to the documentation here. So just a regular copy of the tax return would probably be fine. But yeah, it definitely helps to submit W-2s or the person self-employed, their 1099s or whatnot. So, you know, the more they can submit, again, the more likely the beneficiaries are to get approved, particularly if there's, you know, a big family that they're trying to sponsor. They would want as much documentation as possible. So, let's see. And yeah, so somebody else asked whether we're required to do any independent investigation to confirm the truth of the statements contained in the form. And that's a great question. And that's no. We're just taking at face value what the potential sponsors are providing us. So it's again more of a limited scope representation. So let's see. Is it okay to be a sponsor and also be a lawyer that reviews these applications? I don't see why not. You know, you might, if you're preparing your own and you're a lawyer, that's great. You might want to have someone else look it over, because it's always good to have two sets of eyes. But yeah, I don't think there's any, you know, any problem with that, any conflict there. So will the recording of this session be available to those of us who realized too late we should have been taking careful notes? Yes, it will. So, and sorry, I've been talking fast too, but, and I also have, I can share, or we can hopefully add it to the recording. I had an outline sort of listing some of these points on there, so we can make that available.
So Shannon, I could jump in here because it looks to me like some of the questions are starting to get into what happens next.
Yeah, so that's your part. So please, yeah. Go ahead.
So thank you. That was wonderful. Obviously, each of us needs to go through that I-135, you know, carefully and make sure we're familiar with the questions. And Shannon gave you some really good information about, you know, how to respond or where a response isn't even needed, where you can skip some things on the form as well. I do want to reiterate again that in the online resource document that you should have received, there were links to some additional tips for preparing these applications that were put together by various nonprofit organizations. And so you can also consult those if you have questions. We will be sending out the recording of this. There were some people who initially indicated they were interested in participating today, but couldn't make the time. So the ISBA is recording the session, and we'll make that available to all of you and to others who expressed interest but could not make the training at this time and date. So you'll have access to that. So what's going to happen next, and I think this addresses a couple of the other questions in the comments, is that we have a spreadsheet essentially of your contact information because you have expressed interest in assisting with this project. And we are going to give that spreadsheet to an organization called React DC. They are part of the Sponsor Circle program. React DC has sort of a list of the sponsor circles or individual sponsors that need assistance in having their I-134 reviewed. And they will then sort of match you, and they will reach out to you and say, okay, you know, here are the documents that we would like you to review for this sponsor circle. So React DC will kind of take over the actual matching of the attorneys willing to do this service with the sponsor circles needing some assistance with the I-134. So you will probably be hearing from someone directly from React DC. And so that's sort of how the next step will go. So when you receive those documents from React DC by email is my assumption, but I'm not 100% sure about that. You would probably just convey, you know, any corrections that might be needed back to whatever contact information you are given at that time. So it's not entirely clear to me. I'm assuming that React DC staff is going to put you directly in touch with the sponsor circle so they can send you all the documents, and then you can convey back to them, yep, everything looks great, or hey, you may need to bolster, you know, the copies of the financial documents that you are providing with the declaration. But that will be for React DC to tell you how to do that communication afterwards. One thing that Shannon didn't mention that actually just came up in some of the comments and questions is about the enforceability of the declaration. And they did change this from an affidavit to a declaration, and it is not legally enforceable. It seems kind of strange to us attorneys that, you know, people would be signing this declaration and saying, yes, I agree to financially support these folks. But if they don't provide the support that they have pledged to provide, it's not a legally enforceable contract. And that's been pretty clear that that was the intent of this. So it's more of a moral pledge than it is a legal promise to provide any particular level of support. I will say, having prepared this myself only a couple of times, I'm not as experienced as Shannon is with these documents. It is a lot of personal financial information that is attached. And that's something, you know, I was maybe a little bit surprised at in the beginning, but there is a lot of personal financial information that the sponsor has to provide, you know, through their tax records, their employment, pay stubs, all that sort of thing. Shannon, maybe you can help me with questions you saw that I haven't addressed.
Let's see. Okay, yeah, so there was one I saw where the question was, who is the client? If this is a limited scope representation, how is that reflected by a representation agreement? So I didn't, it's not really a limited scope engagement. I just was using that as sort of an example of a way to think about it. So really, I mean, I guess we're agreeing to review these applications on a pro bono basis. So I guess the sponsor would be, but it's, you know, very minimal, you know, involvement in terms of the attorney-client relationship. It's more about form than substance. But of course, we want to make sure that the substance is right. But do you agree, Cindy? I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit unusual. We're trying to do this fairly quickly, and we are not signing forms and saying that we are taking on representation of these sponsors. We're simply reviewing forms that they've prepared for completeness more than anything else. Some of them may have some of the same questions that you did. Well, what if there's no A number, you know, alien registration number? Can I leave that blank? And you would say yes, you know. So the sponsor circles are not lawyers. They're not going to know the answer to that question. So those are the kinds of questions that you might get from your sponsor circle that is trying to help provide the support for a Ukrainian or a Ukrainian family. There's also a question about time commitment. As you can see, the application is not that long. It probably would not take you very long to review it. You can do as few or as many as you want. There is no specific commitment to do any of these. Again, you will receive a communication from the sponsor circle organization, from React DC, and then you can decide at that point, yes, I can do this, or no, I can't. And, you know, if you can do it, wonderful. If you can't, just let them know and they'll move on to someone else. So there's no specific commitment that you are making. And we will send out follow-up information along with the link to this training. We can resend the document with the online links if you need that, and any other updated information that folks might need.
And I do see one more question on the immigration side, which was, does intent matter when applying for this particular relief? And so what I think Nicola is referring to is in immigration law, if you apply for a temporary visa or some sort of temporary status, you usually cannot have what's called immigrant intent, meaning the intent to relocate here permanently. This is not one of those instances, though. It's specifically, even though it's temporary, you know, the person is allowed to already have something else in process. So most commonly that would probably be an I-130, which is the family-based immigrant visa petition. So yes, those beneficiaries can still apply for this program.
Yeah, and I know Shannon and I both said this at the beginning, but this program for Ukrainians getting this humanitarian parole is different. The government has streamlined the process. There's less required to be filed because the government also recognizes the urgency of the situation. So it is a less formal, more streamlined process than you would do with a normal humanitarian parole application, much less a different kind of immigration, you know, visa type application. So it's a little bit different. There's a question here about whether the beneficiary can work and attend school, and the answer is yes, they can. I know that's not anything to do with, you know, what we're doing in our roles, but yes, they can. The government, again, has made special exceptions for the Afghans and the Ukrainians, and they do receive employment authorization when they come to the United States. There was one other question, I think here, Shannon, about redacting some information about Social Security numbers, bank account numbers. Do you want to address that one?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, but so the sponsor is able to redact their Social Security number and things like that from the supporting documents, but they're also asked to provide that in the declaration, right? So part of the biographic information, I just want to double check if that's actually there still. But yeah, I mean, so, well, it doesn't ask for Social Security number anymore, it looks like. But it's a lot of other personal information, as Cindy mentioned, their address and their, if they do have an alien number, they want that. And so, there's a lot of disclosure going there. But yes, typically when you submit any application to USCIS, a sponsor can redact that information if they need to. USCIS does obviously try to keep everything confidential. There's always the risk of a data leak, but in my experience, it's not really ever been an issue.
And then finally, we did have someone who again asked about signing as the preparer. And just to reiterate, you do not have to. If you want to take on a greater role with one of these families or individuals, you certainly can. That's up to you if you want to provide further pro bono representation or otherwise, but that's not really our purpose here. These should already be prepared when you receive them, and you're just really reviewing them and checking for completeness and making sure that everything was filled out correctly. So you do not have to sign as the preparer. I think we've covered all the questions. And I see a couple of folks posted the online resources in the chat. So if anybody's looking for those, thank you to the folks who posted that in the chat. You can download it from there as well if you can't find the email with the online resources. But in those online resources, there are again links to the USCIS website where you can find the I-134. There are also links to the official USCIS instructions for completing the I-134. And then there are links to the pro bono resources that have been prepared by some different organizations who are assisting Ukrainians with doing this process. So that might also be something to check out after you're done with this and when you're actually sitting down with your first one. If you have questions, many of those questions will be answered through some of those other resources.
All right. Okay, so one more question I think we have time for just came in about, are we assuming that their income, so the question is, by the time we receive the information in the forms for review, are we still checking for any disqualifying factors, such as, does their income and assets meet the standards? Most likely not. I believe that the sponsor circle organizations kind of already have done that, but obviously if you see something that looks well below what would be needed, and I don't remember if I said earlier, it is on the link, the poverty guidelines that are usually used by USCIS. So in terms of the financial standards, again, USCIS is being pretty loose with those in these cases because they are trying to make it a streamlined process. But typically they would look to household size and income and just compare that to the poverty guidelines. So you could check that.
And there's a question here about why ISBA. And it really is just a service that ISBA lawyers are providing to Ukrainians throughout the country. So certainly we've welcomed Ukrainians into Illinois, but these Ukrainians could be located and certainly will be located all across the country. And it is something that the Sponsor Circle organization reached out to me and said, we really have a need for this. And I brought it to the International Immigration Law Section Council of the ISBA. And that section council voted that they wanted to make this a project for our section council and invite the other ISBA lawyers to be involved. So that's why you're here, and that's why you received the invitation to be part of this project. All right, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I want to thank Shannon. We really appreciate her expertise. Thank you for taking the time to walk us through the I-134 today. Thank you to everyone on the call. I have been talking with Ukrainians and Afghans who are in very desperate situations, and I know they are very grateful to all the help that they are receiving from us and from many other people. And so you're doing a great service if you're able to participate in this project. So really appreciate your time and your interest, and wish you the best of luck. And as I said, you should be hearing from Sponsor Circle Organization or React DC in a follow-up email when they're ready to connect you with a Sponsor Circle and have you review some documents.
Yeah, and thank you, Cindy, for organizing this. I know it came through your contacts with React DC, so I know a lot of people, a lot of fellow lawyers were also asking me, you know, what we could do to help, and so this is just a nice way to give back where we can. And also just not the views of the ISBA, but there is an act in Congress right now called the Afghan Adjustment Act, which I would encourage everyone to take a look at, and if you agree with it, to encourage your congressman to vote for it, or congresswoman. It's just another way to try to make good on the promises for our Afghan allies, and hopefully something similar can be done for other refugee groups. So that's my pitch.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.